The rain hammered down on the Dutch countryside in sheets so thick it seemed solid. Through the downpour, a lone Canadian soldier moved along a dike near Zeebrugge, his boots squelching in mud that threatened to pull them off with every step. Corporal Léo Major was supposed to be conducting a reconnaissance patrol with his friend, Corporal Wilfrid Arsenault. But Arsenault had fallen ill, and Major continued alone into German-held territory. His commanding officers had sent an entire company of fresh recruits to capture a nearby town days earlier. They'd vanished without a trace. Major's mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Find out what happened to over 100 men who'd walked into the fog of war and never walked out. Major spotted their equipment first: rifles, ammunition pouches, personal items scattered along the roadside like breadcrumbs marking a path to disaster. The recruits hadn't fought. They'd been captured, likely without firing a shot. He was staring at the remnants of a catastrophe alone in enemy territory with night falling and the temperature dropping toward freezing. Most soldiers would have turned back, reported their findings, called for reinforcements. Major saw an opportunity. Before we understand why this French-Canadian corporal made the decision that would defy every principle of military caution, we need to understand who he was and what had brought him to this rain-soaked dike in the autumn of 1944. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most audacious individual actions, consider subscribing to the channel. We bring you the untold stories of courage and tactical genius that shaped history. The making of a one-man army. Léo Major was born in 1921 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but grew up in Montreal, Quebec. He spoke French with a working-class accent, stood shorter than regulation height, and possessed a personality that military discipline struggled to contain. By October 1944, he was already a legend in the Régiment de la Chaudière. He'd lost his left eye to a phosphorus grenade during the Normandy campaign, an injury that should have sent him home. Instead, Major refused evacuation. He told the medical officers he only needed one eye to look down a rifle sight. According to him, the black eye patch made him look like a pirate. The Canadian Army, desperate for experienced combat troops, let him stay. His previous actions had already earned him a reputation that made officers nervous. Major didn't follow orders so much as interpret them creatively. He took reconnaissance missions and turned them into one-man raids. He moved through enemy territory with a confidence that bordered on recklessness, but was actually built on extraordinary tactical awareness. He understood something fundamental that many soldiers never grasped. In combat, audacity often provides better protection than caution. German soldiers expected patrols, ambushes, coordinated attacks. They didn't expect a single Canadian with an eye patch to walk into their positions and start giving orders. The weapon slung across Major's back that rainy October evening was a Sten gun, Britain's cheap, stamped metal answer to the German MP-40 submachine gun. The Sten was notoriously unreliable, prone to jamming, and would fire accidentally if you looked at it wrong. But it was light, fired fast, and in Major's hands, it became an instrument of psychological warfare. He also carried grenades, a combat knife, and an attitude that German military doctrine had no protocol for handling. The Scheldt. Where empires bleed, the Battle of the Scheldt was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a grinding, multi-week campaign to open the approaches to Antwerp, Belgium's massive port city. Allied forces had captured Antwerp on September 4, 1944, virtually intact, a logistical prize beyond measure. But the Germans still controlled both sides of the Scheldt estuary, the 50-mile waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea. Without clearing this corridor, the port was useless. Every Allied soldier pushing toward Germany's border still depended on supplies, trucked hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches. The supply lines were stretched so thin that frontline units were running out of ammunition, fuel, and food. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had gambled on Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault intended to seize bridges across the Rhine and end the war by Christmas. It failed catastrophically. Now in early October, with winter approaching and the German army reconstituting itself along the Reich's borders, the Allies faced a brutal truth. They needed Antwerp operational, or the entire advance would stall. The mission to clear the Scheldt fell to the 1st Canadian Army, reinforced by British units and Polish armored divisions. The Germans defending the Scheldt were a mixed force. General Wilhelm Dacer commanded a garrison cobbled together from Kriegsmarine coastal artillery battalions, Heer infantry divisions, and remnants of units mauled during the retreat from France. They lacked mobility, heavy weapons, and air support. What they possessed was terrain that favored the defender absolutely. The Dutch polder landscape around the Scheldt consisted of flat fields below sea level, crisscrossed by canals and protected by dikes. A handful of soldiers with machine guns could control entire sectors. The Germans flooded fields deliberately, channeling attackers into kill zones. They deployed the feared 20mm flak guns, weapons that could turn a human being into a red mist in seconds. They sowed mines everywhere, turning roads and paths into death traps. The Canadian forces assigned to clear the Breskens pocket south of the Scheldt and advance through South Beveland faced a nightmare scenario. Frontal assaults across canals resulted in horrific casualties. The 4th Canadian Armored Division's initial attempt to storm the Leopold Canal ended in bloody repulse. Engineers struggled to build bridges under withering fire. Infantry companies lost half their strength capturing single villages. The fighting was personal, intimate, and merciless. German defenders knew that every day they held the Scheldt was another day the Wehrmacht had to prepare defenses in Germany itself. Major's regiment, the Régiment de la Chaudière, was part of this grinding campaign. They conducted reconnaissance patrols, probed German defenses, and gathered intelligence on enemy positions. It was dangerous, unglamorous work. Patrols disappeared regularly, ambushed by German units that knew every hedgerow and farmhouse. The company of recruits Major was searching for had walked into one of these ambushes. They were green troops, probably surrendered when surrounded, rather than fight to the death. The Germans had marched them to a rear area holding facility, one more successful operation in a defensive campaign that had already exceeded Berlin's expectations. The dike and the decision major found shelter from the rain in an abandoned house near the dike. Water dripped through the roof. The floor was littered with the debris of hasty evacuation, broken furniture, scattered possessions, a child's toy. He was studying his map, trying to determine the location of the nearest German headquarters, when movement outside caught his attention. 2 German soldiers were walking along the dike, visible against the gray sky. They weren't on patrol. Their body language suggested they were simply moving from one position to another, possibly heading to a command post or supply depot. Major made his decision in seconds. He moved out of the house and approached the Germans from an angle that kept him below their sight line. The technique was basic fieldcraft. Use terrain to mask your approach. Close the distance before the enemy can react. Present overwhelming force at the critical moment. The first German soldier registered Major's presence too late. Major had the Sten gun leveled at his chest and was speaking in rapid, accented German, ordering him to drop his weapon. The soldier complied. He was probably Kriegsmarine, a radar operator or coastal artillery crewman, not frontline infantry. His hands went up immediately. The second German reacted slowly, confusion written across his face. In the rain and gathering dusk, Major could have been anyone, a German officer, a military policeman checking papers. By the time the second soldier understood the situation, Major had positioned the first German between himself and the second, using the captured soldier as a human shield. The Sten gun never wavered. The message was clear. Resistance meant His comrade died first. The second German raised his hands. Now Major faced a tactical problem. He had 2 prisoners and no backup. Standard procedure dictated he march them back to Canadian lines, report the capture, and continue his reconnaissance later. Instead, Major began interrogating them in German. Where was their unit? How many men? Where was the commanding officer? The Germans, rattled by this one-eyed Canadian who'd appeared out of the rain, answered. Their company headquarters was nearby in a fortified farmhouse. Approximately 100 men were stationed there, a mixture of coastal artillery personnel and infantry from the 70th Infantry Division. Major's plan formed as they talked. He would use these 2 prisoners as bait, march them toward their own headquarters, presenting himself not as a lone Canadian scout, but as part of a larger capture operation. The psychological effect would be critical. German soldiers, seeing their comrades under guard, would assume they were surrounded. In the confusion of rain and failing light, Major could amplify the perception of Allied strength. It was audacious to the point of insanity. It was also exactly the kind of operation that might work precisely because it was so unexpected. Marching into the lion's den, Major forced his 2 prisoners ahead of him, keeping the Sten gun visible but not obviously threatening. He wanted German sentries to see captured soldiers being escorted, not a firefight in progress. The approach to the German position was a muddy track leading to a cluster of farm buildings. Barbed wire marked the perimeter. Sentries watched from foxholes. Major counted at least 6 visible positions. The farmhouse itself was built like a fortress, its thick stone walls capable of stopping small arms fire. A German voice challenged them. Major pushed one prisoner forward and shouted back in German, announcing captured personnel. The linguistic sleight of hand worked. Sentries saw the scene they expected, 2 soldiers who'd been caught by an Allied patrol now being processed. Major was gambling that, in the rain and darkness, his Canadian uniform wouldn't be immediately obvious. He kept moving, pushing deeper into the German position. The critical moment came when a German officer emerged from the farmhouse. He was an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, likely the company commander. He took one look at the scene, and his face changed. Something was wrong. The escorting soldier was alone. The uniform was wrong. The officer's hand dropped toward his pistol. Major's Sten gun came up, and his voice cut through the rain with absolute authority. Surrender, or everyone dies. The threat wasn't empty. Major had his finger on the trigger. At this range, he could kill a dozen men before they could organize resistance. The grenades on his belt were visible. If shooting started, it would be a massacre, and the German officer knew it would claim his men as much as the lone Canadian. The Oberleutnant made the calculation every combat officer dreads. He was responsible for approximately 100 men, many of them not combat infantry but support personnel. They were tired, undersupplied, and fighting a defensive campaign that everyone knew was ultimately futile. Resistance might kill this crazy Canadian, but it would certainly cost German lives. And for what? To hold a farmhouse for another day? The war was already lost. Intelligent German officers knew it, even if they couldn't say it aloud. The Oberleutnant raised his hands and ordered his men to surrender. The cascade effect. What happened next demonstrated Major's understanding of combat psychology. He didn't relax. He maintained absolute tactical intensity, barking orders in German, directing prisoners to drop weapons and move into the farmhouse yard. He created the illusion of a larger force by constant movement, appearing in different positions, suggesting more Canadians were surrounding the area. German soldiers emerged from defensive positions, hands raised, weapons abandoned. They expected to see Allied troops moving in to secure the capture. Instead, they saw only the one-eyed corporal with the Sten gun. The compound held more men than Major initially estimated. As he conducted his improvised prisoner processing, the count climbed past 50, then 70, then 90. Some were Kriegsmarine radar operators who'd never fired a weapon in combat. Others were infantry replacements, young soldiers recently arrived from Germany. A few were veterans, men with combat decorations and hard eyes, who watched Major with professional interest, trying to understand how one man had walked into their position and taken control. 3 German soldiers refused to surrender. They attempted to resist, either from genuine commitment to the Nazi cause or simple refusal to accept the humiliation of capture by a lone enemy. Major killed all 3. The Sten gun fired its distinctive metallic chatter. Bodies fell. The message to the remaining Germans was crystal clear. Cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant death. Major was not conducting a negotiation. He was executing a tactical operation, and casualties were acceptable. The final count was 93 German prisoners. Major had captured nearly a full company of enemy soldiers by himself, using nothing but tactical audacity and psychological manipulation. He organized them into a column and began the march back toward Canadian lines. The Germans walked in stunned silence, still processing what had happened. Some of them probably felt relief. They were out of the war. Others felt humiliation. They'd been defeated without a proper fight. The march back, moving 93 prisoners through enemy territory without backup, was almost as dangerous as capturing them. Major was now responsible for preventing escape attempts, avoiding German patrols, and reaching Canadian lines before his prisoners decided that one guard was insufficient deterrent. He positioned himself at the rear of the column, where he could observe the entire formation. Any prisoner who attempted to run would have to break from the group, making them an easy target. Major kept the Sten gun visible and maintained constant verbal control, issuing orders in German, keeping the prisoners moving. The march took hours. Rain continued to fall. Mud sucked at boots. The column moved through the same countryside Major had scouted earlier, now transformed by darkness and the surreal nature of his achievement. German defensive positions they passed were empty or lightly held. The Battle of the Scheldt was grinding toward its conclusion. German forces were being compressed into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. The capture of nearly 100 men from a single company would accelerate that process, removing trained soldiers from the defensive line. When Major finally reached Canadian lines, the sentries couldn't believe what they were seeing. A single corporal was marching in 93 German prisoners. Officers emerged from command posts to witness the spectacle. Major's own commanding officer stared at the column, then at Major, then back at the prisoners. Questions came rapid fire. How did you capture them? Where is your patrol? Did you have support? Major's answers were characteristically blunt. He'd found the missing company's equipment, tracked the Germans who'd captured them, and decided to return the favor. Military intelligence officers immediately began processing the prisoners. Information extracted from captured enemy soldiers could reveal defensive positions, unit strengths, and tactical intentions. The 93 men Major brought in represented a significant intelligence windfall. More importantly, they represented 93 fewer soldiers defending the Scheldt approaches. Every prisoner was one less machine gunner, one less artillery observer, one less obstacle to clearing the estuary. Recognition and rejection. The Canadian Army nominated Major for a Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions at the Scheldt. The DCM was second only to the Victoria Cross in recognizing combat valor. It acknowledged courage under fire, exceptional leadership, and tactical brilliance. The official citation would note Major's single-handed capture of 93 enemy soldiers, an achievement that strained credibility but was verified by multiple witnesses and the prisoners themselves. Major's response to the nomination was characteristically unconventional. He reportedly stated he didn't want the medal because he felt the general who would present it was incompetent. This wasn't modesty or false humility. Major had genuine contempt for officers he considered poor leaders. He'd seen too many soldiers die from bad decisions made by commanders far from the front lines. The politics of military recognition meant little to him compared to the practical reality of combat effectiveness. Eventually, he accepted the DCM, but his initial reaction revealed the core of his personality. Respect had to be earned through competence, not awarded through rank. The action at the Scheldt was not the end of Major's war. His legend would grow even larger. In April 1945, he would single-handedly liberate the Dutch city of Zwolle, conducting a one-man guerrilla campaign through the streets that convinced an entire German garrison to evacuate. He would survive stepping on a landmine, refuse evacuation despite severe injuries, and return to combat within weeks. His tactics were studied, criticized, and celebrated. He represented a type of soldier that institutional military structures struggled to accommodate. The individual who operated outside standard doctrine but achieved results that vindicated his methods. The nature of audacity. Understanding Major's success requires examining the psychological dynamics of combat. Military doctrine emphasizes combined arms operations, coordinated movements, and overwhelming force. These principles are sound. They minimize friendly casualties and maximize the chance of victory. But doctrine assumes relatively conventional circumstances. It doesn't account for situations where conventional approaches are impossible, or when speed and surprise offer advantages that firepower cannot. Major understood that combat is fundamentally about controlling the enemy's decision-making process. The German officer at the farmhouse faced a split-second calculation. Major presented him with a scenario where resistance seemed certain to cause friendly casualties without guaranteeing success. The officer chose surrender not because he was cowardly, but because the tactical mathematics favored that decision. Major had created conditions where the rational choice was capitulation. This psychological warfare was as effective as any artillery barrage. The Germans who surrendered weren't defeated by superior firepower. They were defeated by the perception of inevitability. Major's absolute confidence, his willingness to walk into their position alone, suggested he knew something they didn't. Perhaps Canadian forces were surrounding the area. Perhaps an artillery strike was imminent. Perhaps resistance would trigger a level of violence disproportionate to the strategic value of the position. All these calculations raced through the German commander's mind in the seconds before he raised his hands. The broader context of the Scheldt campaign reinforced this psychological effect. By October 1944, German soldiers understood they were fighting a defensive war. The Reich was contracting. Allied forces controlled the air, possessed overwhelming material superiority, and were advancing on all fronts. Individual German units could fight well, could inflict casualties, could delay the inevitable, but the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Surrender meant survival and an end to the constant danger of combat. For many German soldiers, especially those in secondary formations like coastal artillery units, the prospect of captivity was not necessarily unwelcome. The tactical environment. The terrain around the Scheldt also played a crucial role in Major's success. The flat polder landscape offered few hiding places, but also limited visibility in rain and darkness. German defensive positions were designed to repel large-scale attacks, not to defend against a single infiltrator. Their fortifications faced outward, toward expected avenues of Allied approach. Major came from an unexpected direction, having penetrated deep into their rear area before the capture operation began. The German defenders at the farmhouse were also likely experiencing combat fatigue. The Battle of the Scheldt had been raging for weeks. Allied artillery pounded German positions constantly. Allied air superiority meant Luftwaffe support was non-existent. Supply lines were disrupted. Food was scarce. The Wehrmacht units defending the estuary were enduring conditions that ground down morale and combat effectiveness. Soldiers in this state make different decisions than fresh troops. Surrender becomes more attractive when you're cold, hungry, and exhausted. Major's timing was also perfect. He struck during a period when German units were adjusting positions, moving between defensive locations. The company he captured was in transition, possibly rotating from frontline positions to rear area security duties. They were vulnerable in a way they wouldn't have been if dug into prepared defenses. Major's reconnaissance had identified this vulnerability, even if intuitively, rather than through formal intelligence analysis. The weapon selection mattered too. The Sten gun was unreliable, but possessed two critical advantages. It looked menacing and fired fast. German soldiers trained on the MP-40 understood submachine gun capabilities. At close range, a submachine gun could kill multiple targets in seconds. Major's Sten, despite its mechanical flaws, was sufficient threat to cow dozens of men who didn't want to die for a farmhouse in the Dutch lowlands. The human element strip away the tactical analysis, and Major's achievement comes down to will. He possessed the mental fortitude to walk alone into enemy territory and impose his decisions on men who outnumbered him 100 to 1. This quality is rare. Military training attempts to instill aggression, initiative, and confidence. But there's a fundamental difference between trained courage and the innate drive that allows someone to operate effectively in isolation without support or fallback options. Major was not suicidal. He calculated risks carefully. His actions appeared reckless, but were built on excellent tactical awareness. He understood his capabilities, understood German psychology, and understood how to manipulate the immediate environment to his advantage. The combination created opportunities that more cautious soldiers would never recognize. When other soldiers saw a German-held farmhouse, they saw an obstacle requiring platoon-strength assault. Major saw 93 prisoners waiting to be captured. His background informed this mindset. Growing up in Montreal's working-class neighborhoods taught survival skills that military academies don't address. He understood intimidation, negotiation under pressure, and how to read people's intentions through body language and tone. These street-learned abilities translated directly to combat. The German officer at the farmhouse wasn't defeated by Canadian military doctrine. He was defeated by a man who understood exactly how far to push before triggering desperate resistance. The loss of Major's eye earlier in the war also played a role. Surviving a severe injury and refusing medical evacuation demonstrated commitment that other soldiers recognized. He'd proven his willingness to endure pain and continue fighting. This reputation preceded him. German soldiers who'd encountered Canadian forces knew about hard men who fought savagely. Major embodied that reputation. His physical appearance with the black eye patch reinforced the psychological impact. He looked like a pirate, and he fought with piratical disregard for conventional rules. Legacy of the lone operator. Major's actions at the Scheldt represent an extreme example of individual initiative in military operations. Modern military doctrine emphasizes teamwork and coordinated operations because those approaches are reliably effective, but warfare remains fundamentally unpredictable. Situations arise where standard operating procedures don't apply, where communication breaks down, where individual soldiers must make decisions that doctrine doesn't cover. Major excelled in precisely these environments. His methods couldn't be institutionalized. You can't train soldiers to walk alone into enemy strongholds and bluff their way to mass captures. What you can study is his decision-making process. He assessed the tactical situation, identified enemy vulnerabilities, calculated acceptable risks, and executed a plan with absolute commitment. These skills are teachable, even if Major's extreme application of them was unique. The psychological impact of his achievement extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. Stories of Major's exploits spread through both Canadian and German units. Canadian soldiers gained a morale boost from knowing they had fighters of his caliber. German soldiers faced increased uncertainty, wondering if the next lone scout they encountered might be another major. This psychological warfare operates on a strategic level that formal operations struggle to quantify. The Scheldt's end. The Battle of the Scheldt concluded on November 8, 1944, when Canadian forces cleared the last German resistance on Walcheren Island. The campaign cost the 1st Canadian Army approximately 13,000 casualties. German forces lost similar numbers killed and wounded, plus tens of thousands captured. The estuary was finally open to Allied shipping. Minesweepers began the dangerous work of clearing waterways. By late November, the first convoys reached Antwerp's docks, bringing the supplies that would fuel the final Allied drive into Germany. Major's capture of 93 Germans was a tiny footnote in this larger campaign, yet it exemplified the individual actions that collectively determined outcomes. While generals planned operations and divisions maneuvered, individual soldiers like Major created tactical openings that shaped the battle's progression. The 93 prisoners he brought in reduced German defensive strength by 1 company. That company's absence created a gap that Canadian forces exploited. Small actions cascaded into operational advantages. The Canadian Army's performance at the Scheldt earned them respect they'd sometimes lacked earlier in the war. They'd fought through terrible terrain against determined opposition and won. The victory was grinding and costly but complete. German forces were eliminated from the estuary. Antwerp became operational. The Allied logistical crisis was resolved. The war would continue into 1945, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Scheldt campaign had secured the supply lines that would sustain Allied armies to final victory. The question of perfidy. Major's use of captured German soldiers as bait raises questions about combat legality. International law, specifically the Hague Conventions and later Geneva Conventions, addresses permissible deception in warfare. Ruses de guerre, legitimate military deceptions, are explicitly allowed. These include ambushes, false radio messages, camouflage, feints, and misleading information. What's prohibited is perfidy, pretending to surrender, misusing protective emblems like the Red Cross, or abusing safeguards like white flags to gain tactical advantage. Major's actions fall into a gray area. He didn't pretend to surrender. He captured enemy soldiers and used them to approach a German position, creating confusion about the tactical situation. This technique resembles legitimate ruse de guerre more than prohibited perfidy. However, the psychological manipulation involved walks a fine line. The German defenders were deceived about the size and nature of the attacking force. They surrendered based on false assumptions about their tactical situation. Historical context matters. The Battle of the Scheldt occurred during a war where both sides had already committed far more serious violations of combat law. German forces regularly executed prisoners, used white flags as bait for ambushes, and conducted operations that deliberately blurred the lines of legitimate combat. Allied forces responded with increased skepticism toward German surrender attempts, sometimes shooting prisoners rather than risk perfidious attacks. In this environment, Major's tactical deception was relatively mild. The ethical calculus also considers outcomes. Major's technique resulted in 93 prisoners rather than a firefight that would have killed dozens on both sides. From a humanitarian perspective, deception that prevents bloodshed is arguably more ethical than honest combat that maximizes casualties. Military necessity permitted Major's actions. His mission was to gather intelligence and disrupt German defenses. He accomplished both objectives while minimizing loss of life. The German soldiers who surrendered survived the war. Those who would have fought and died in a conventional assault were spared. Combat psychology and surrender. The dynamics of surrender in combat are more complex than civilian understanding typically recognizes. Soldiers don't surrender because they're cowardly. They surrender when continued resistance seems futile or when the costs of fighting exceed the perceived benefits. The German soldiers at the farmhouse made a rational calculation. Their strategic situation was hopeless. The war was lost. Their specific position had no critical value. Fighting would cost lives without changing outcomes. Surrender meant survival. This calculation was easier for non-combat troops. The Kriegsmarine coastal artillery personnel and rear echelon soldiers at the farmhouse hadn't undergone the intensive indoctrination that frontline SS or Wehrmacht infantry received. They were technicians, radar operators, supply clerks. Their loyalty to the Nazi regime was functional rather than ideological. Capture meant the end of military service, but not necessarily betrayal of deeply held beliefs. The presence of a commanding officer also facilitated surrender. When the Oberleutnant raised his hands, he gave his men permission to do likewise. Junior soldiers follow officer directives even in surrender situations. The officer's decision removed individual responsibility. Each soldier could tell himself he'd obeyed orders rather than chosen personal survival over continued resistance. This psychological mechanism allowed mass surrender without individual shame. Major understood these dynamics instinctively. He focused pressure on the commanding officer rather than individual soldiers. Once the officer surrendered, the company followed. This technique is standard in capture operations, but requires correctly identifying who holds decision-making authority. Major assessed the German organizational structure instantly and applied pressure at the critical point. The skill involved is not obvious, but was essential to success. The broader strategic picture. While Major was capturing Germans in the Scheldt, the war's strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. The Soviet Union was grinding through Poland toward Germany's eastern borders. Allied forces in Italy had broken through the Gothic Line and were advancing northward. Strategic bombing had devastated German industrial capacity. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. U-boats no longer controlled the Atlantic. Germany's allies had collapsed or switched sides. The Reich was fighting a defensive war on all fronts. Yet the fighting continued. German soldiers still resisted. Cities were defended. Counterattacks were launched. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 would temporarily throw Allied forces into disarray. The war wouldn't end until May 1945. Hundreds of thousands more soldiers would die in combat that changed nothing strategically but cost everything personally. Understanding this context explains why German soldiers like those at the farmhouse chose surrender. They were fighting for a lost cause. Capture meant an end to the constant danger and eventual return home. Allied strategy required clearing every pocket of German resistance. You couldn't leave enemy forces in your rear areas. Supply lines needed security. Ports like Antwerp required safe approaches. This meant fighting campaigns like the Scheldt that had clear objectives but terrible costs. The Canadian Army's casualties reflected the difficulty of dislodging determined defenders from favorable terrain. Yet the campaign succeeded. German forces were eliminated. Antwerp became operational. The strategic objective was achieved. Major's individual action fit into this broader campaign. Every German soldier captured was one less defender. Every intelligence report from prisoners improved tactical planning. Every successful patrol increased Allied confidence and German demoralization. Wars are won through accumulated small victories as much as dramatic large battles. Major's capture of 93 soldiers was one small victory in a campaign of thousands, but it mattered. After the Scheldt, Major's war didn't end with his Scheldt achievement. He continued combat operations through the winter of 1944-45. In April 1945, he participated in the liberation of the Netherlands. The story of his single-handed liberation of Zwolle would become even more famous than his Scheldt capture. He conducted a night-long guerrilla campaign through the city, attacking German positions, setting fires, creating chaos. The German garrison evacuated, believing they faced a major Allied assault. When dawn broke, the citizens of Zwolle discovered their city had been liberated by essentially one man. Major accepted a second Distinguished Conduct Medal for this action, becoming one of only 3 Canadians to receive the DCM twice. His combat service left physical and psychological scars. He survived multiple serious injuries, including stepping on a landmine. The loss of his eye was permanent. He lived with pain from wounds that never fully healed. After the war, he returned to Canada and struggled to adjust to civilian life, a common experience for combat veterans. The skills that made him effective in warfare didn't translate easily to peacetime society. His daughter later noted that he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, another common pattern among combat veterans. The recognition Major received evolved over decades. Initially, his actions were known primarily within military circles and among Dutch civilians who remembered the liberation. Later, historians and military analysts studying individual initiative in combat discovered his story. Books were written, documentaries were produced. The Dutch government honored him repeatedly, recognizing his role in their liberation. He became an example of extraordinary individual achievement in military history. Modern military analysis. Contemporary military professionals study Major's actions as examples of mission-type tactics, where junior leaders are given objectives and freedom to achieve them through individual initiative. The German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission command, emphasizes this approach. It assumes junior officers and NCOs possess tactical competence and will make sound decisions without constant supervision. Major exemplified this concept, even though Canadian military doctrine didn't formally embrace it. Special operations forces today train operators to conduct missions with minimal support, operating behind enemy lines, adapting to changing circumstances, achieving objectives through unconventional means. Major's Scheldt operation resembles modern special operations missions in its emphasis on individual capability, psychological warfare, and tactical flexibility. He was essentially conducting special operations before that terminology existed. The limitations of his approach are also studied. Major's methods worked because he possessed exceptional capabilities and faced specific tactical situations. Institutional military forces can't rely on exceptional individuals. Doctrine must work for average soldiers in typical circumstances. Teaching conventional forces to operate like Major risks encouraging reckless behavior that gets soldiers killed without achieving objectives. The balance between encouraging initiative and maintaining tactical discipline remains a challenge for military training. Technology has changed the tactical environment since 1944. Modern communications allow soldiers to maintain contact with command structures even when physically isolated. Surveillance systems make infiltration more difficult. Precision weapons allow small units to call in devastating firepower. Yet the fundamental principles Major demonstrated remain relevant. Understanding enemy psychology, exploiting tactical opportunities, maintaining initiative, and accepting calculated risks are timeless combat skills. The human cost behind the dramatic narrative of Major's achievement lies the human cost of the Scheldt campaign. 13,000 Canadian casualties represented families destroyed, lives altered, potential unrealized. The soldiers who died in frontal assaults across canals, who stepped on mines, who were cut down by machine gun fire, possessed the same courage as Major. They simply didn't have his exceptional abilities or his opportunities for individual action. Their deaths bought the victory that opened Antwerp's port. The German casualties deserve recognition too. Many German soldiers fighting at the Scheldt were not Nazi ideologues, but conscripts serving their country as they understood that obligation. They fought in terrible conditions, undersupplied and facing inevitable defeat. Those who died defending positions their commanders ordered them to hold showed courage even in service of a regime that history rightly condemns. The 93 men Major captured survived the war because they surrendered. Countless others died fighting battles they couldn't win. The Dutch civilian population endured occupation, bombardment, and deliberate flooding that destroyed farmland and homes. The bombing of Walcheren's dikes killed 180 civilians and flooded much of the island. These were deliberate Allied actions intended to neutralize German defenses. The civilian casualties were considered acceptable costs for achieving military objectives. Modern military ethics would scrutinize such decisions more carefully, but in 1944's total war environment, operational necessity overrode civilian safety considerations. Remembering Léo Major died in 2008 at age 87. His passing was noted in Canadian military circles and remembered in the Netherlands, where he remained a hero to the communities he'd helped liberate. His story exemplifies individual courage in circumstances that demanded superhuman effort. He showed that initiative, intelligence, and audacity could achieve results that firepower and numbers couldn't match. The question his life raises is whether such men are born or made. Major's background suggests both nature and circumstance shaped his capabilities. He possessed innate qualities, physical courage, tactical intuition, mental resilience. But combat experience refined these qualities into exceptional effectiveness. His wounds, rather than deterring him, seemed to increase his determination. Each survival reinforced his confidence that he could overcome any tactical situation. His story also raises questions about military culture. The Canadian Army allowed Major to continue combat operations despite losing an eye, despite repeated injuries, despite behavior that sometimes contradicted orders. They recognized his value outweighed his unconventionality. Some military organizations would have forced him into support roles or medical discharge. The Canadian approach, whether deliberate policy or pragmatic accommodation, enabled Major's achievements. For the soldiers he fought beside, Major represented both inspiration and reproach. Inspiration because he demonstrated what individual courage could achieve. Reproach because most soldiers couldn't match his capabilities and knew it. Combat creates terrible self-knowledge. You discover your limits under conditions that punish weakness. Major's exceptional performance highlighted average soldiers' ordinary courage, yet his achievements protected them too. Every German position he neutralized was one less threat to his comrades. The enduring lesson. The story of Léo Major's capture of 93 German soldiers at the Scheldt endures because it speaks to fundamental questions about courage, initiative, and individual capability. In an era of mechanized warfare, satellite surveillance, and precision weapons, his story reminds us that wars are still fought by individuals making decisions under impossible pressure. Technology enhances capabilities, but doesn't replace human judgment. His technique, walking alone into enemy territory and bluffing his way to mass capture, cannot be replicated through training. But the mindset that enabled it can be studied and cultivated. Assessing tactical situations independently, identifying enemy vulnerabilities, accepting risks when potential gains justify them, these are teachable skills. Major applied them at an exceptional level, but every combat soldier exercises them to some degree. The moral ambiguity of his methods also deserves consideration. He used captured soldiers as bait, deceived German defenders about his force strength, and killed 3 soldiers who resisted while accepting surrender from 90 others. These actions saved lives overall, but involved calculations about acceptable violence that most people never face. Combat ethics operate in a space where civilian morality struggles to reach. Major's decisions were legal under military law and justified by necessity, but they involved taking human life and manipulating human psychology in ways that peacetime ethics would condemn. Ultimately, Léo Major's story is about the terrible demands war places on individuals and the extraordinary capabilities some people reveal under those demands. He was not a superhero. He was a soldier who understood his capabilities, recognized tactical opportunities, and possessed the courage to act when action defied conventional wisdom. The 93 German soldiers who surrendered to him went home to their families after the war. Their lives were preserved by Major's audacity and their officers' wisdom in recognizing a situation where fighting meant dying for no strategic purpose. On a rain-soaked evening in the Dutch lowlands in the autumn of 1944, one Canadian corporal with an eye patch and a Sting gun changed the mathematics of surrender and survival. That achievement, small in the war's vast scale but enormous in its immediate impact, represents the enduring human element in warfare that no doctrine can fully capture and no technology can fully replace.